In this section of the lecture, I'll be talking about the transition that China has made from having a command-based method of organising economic activity to having an economy that has increasingly allowed a greater role for markets in the organisation of economic activity. After Mao Zedong's death in 1976, there's a battle for political control between the heirs to the Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four, and the Chinese army, who are increasingly concerned about military security with regard to the Soviet Union, and would like to see greater economic progress as a basis for greater military security. That political battle is resolved when the army arrests the Gang of Four. Deng Xiaoping becomes head of the Chinese Communist Party, and at the December 1978 Third Plenum, a new era in Chinese politics and economics begins, the reform era. Just to start out with a couple of general comments about this reform era. This era is really characterized by a change in attitude amongst China's leaders, that there really is an orientation towards economic growth that hadn't existed in this same way for at least the period back to the 1950s, when Mao was initially trying to industrialize the economy. And so this quote from Alexander Gerschenkron says about how in a backward country, the great and sudden industrialization effort calls for a new deal in emotions. So making the point that in a lot of countries, for example in China, what really marks the start of the industrialization process is a galvanizing of attitudes that is broader than just one person, but is spread through the leadership of a society, and eventually has to become even more widespread than that. There has to be an attitude that commits towards economic growth. And we've seen that on some other occasions. For example, Japan, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, is described as a country where there was this general political and social commitment towards making economic growth the objective. Now, when we talk about this reform era, and this will become evident later on in this section of the lecture as I go through some of the details of the nature of reform, but it is not the case that the Chinese Communist Party in 1978 began with, as I've said it here, an elaborate blueprint for reform. While they started off with some general ideas about the direction that they wanted to head, opening up to international trade, more extensive use of markets, there weren't specific policies in place. Often that finding of specific policies has been an incremental and sometimes almost by chance process. And so a version of the English version of a Chinese proverb that some commentators use to describe this reform period is groping for stones to cross the river. If you ever sort of crossed a river with bits of stones there, you're looking for the stone to stand on to stop your feet getting wet to get to the other side. And so you stand on one stone and then you look around to see what the next stone would be, rather than being able to walk across a bridge to the other side. That's an appropriate way to characterize the reforms that have occurred in China. It is important as a second point to say that the reform process has been a continuous process. So again, this is almost a corollary of the point on the last slide, that this wasn't, the reform agenda in China has not been an agenda that arrived fully formed in 1978 and has simply been sort of worked out since then, and that at some period after 1978 expired. In fact, it didn't arrive fully formed. It's been a progressive process, but it's also been a continuous process. It's been a process of continually seeking to reform the organisation of the economy to drive further economic growth. And so this quote from Zhao Dongzhu says, whenever the effect of one set of reforms on productivity growth seemed to be exhausted, the Chinese government found a way to initiate new reforms that reignited growth. And so that's something that, again, will become evident as we work through some of the reforms that occurred. So here is a table that just gives you a perspective on the years before the shift to the market economy versus the market economy. So 1952 to 1978, you can see that the rate of growth in GDP per capita is 3%, whereas after 1978 through to 2007, it's 8%. So a substantially higher rate of growth being achieved. What was it that drove that? Well, you can see that labour participation, similar effect. Higher education, definitely that had some effect, but similar between the communist and the market periods. The big difference has been in the effect of total factor productivity and capital output. So you can see the idea that in the communist era, the big thing that was driving economic activity was the forced industrialization, the forced introduction of industry to be a larger part of the economy, underpinned by the introduction of new capital equipment. That was what was driving economic growth during that period. In fact, efficiency measured by total factor productivity is negative during that period. The level of efficiency with which resources are used is actually falling during this period. And that goes back to the last section of the lecture where I talked about the perils of planning. During the period in the market-based economy, the reform period, you can see that total factor productivity is having a big effect, that's actually increasingly a factor in explaining the economic development that's occurring. A cross-country perspective, so I thought I'd choose a couple of different countries to compare against than I did at the start of the lecture. So I've compared against Brazil and India, and you can see the remarkable takeoff that's occurred in China's GDP per capita. So China and India sort of after 1960 actually going along quite similarly until the mid-1990s. So you can see, as we talked about in the section of the lecture on India, India has an improving economic performance during this period as well, similar to China, but that after the mid-1990s, China has really accelerated away. India's kept growing, but at nowhere near like the rapid rate of growth in China. Brazil, a country that's often talked about as being one of the BRIC economies, noted as a notable economic performer, you can see that China really in terms of rates of growth puts Brazil into the shade. So while there's definitely been sort of impressive economic growth in Brazil over the period from 1950, extremely impressive growth, if we're looking sort of just at the period from the mid-1990s, China's performance has been exceptional, and it's almost caught up to Brazil in terms of GDP per capita. So in the period in which China has been a reformed market-based economy, its economic performance has been stunning, and its rate of economic growth has got stronger and stronger during this period. And as I mentioned in the first section of the first section of this lecture, that's had huge effects on human well-being in China, lifting several hundred million people out of poverty. So this is a gigantic event on a world scale when we think about the well-being of the world's population. What I'm going to do now is talk about a little bit about some of the reforms that occurred during this period, starting out with the first phase of reform from 1978 to the late 1980s. What happens first is that the Chinese government introduces some reforms to the agricultural sector, which are twofold. Firstly, they introduce a system where they say, look, you still have to provide us with a particular quota of grain that you're producing each month or each year. But if you produce above that quota, then you're allowed to sell that quota at prices which are going to be market prices, higher than the quota-based prices which are paid for the quota that the farmers have to provide to the state. So basically by doing that, they now introduce an incentive for producing more than the quota amount. Because if you produce more than the quota, you can sell that output at a market price, which is even higher than the price that you're getting for selling your quota amount. And there are increases in prices as well. And what happens is that in some regions where this scheme is rolled out earliest or it's allowed to go out furthest, it's observed that the increases in productivity in agriculture are greatest. And so at this stage, the Chinese government, the Central Party, gives the green light for this system, which becomes known as the household responsibility system, to be rolled out across the whole of the agricultural sector in China. And there are large increases in productivity in the agricultural sector then from 1978 to 84. Labour productivity in the agricultural sector grows by about 9%. Now, it would be wrong to attribute that just to the shift to market-based reforms. There'd been large-scale irrigation projects in the 1950s to 70s which had improved water availability. The introduction of dwarf rice had improved productivity, and the greater availability of fertilisers had improved soil nutrients and improved productivity. So there are other contributing factors as well, but it's seen that this shift to a greater role for market activity is one contributing factor to the improvement in productivity. The second stage is what are known as the township and village enterprises, and this is the introduction of small-scale industrialisation to rural areas. Sometimes it's former collectives doing this. Sometimes it's excess labour, which because of the increase in productivity in the agricultural sector is released from agriculture and becomes available to work in industry, working to produce small-scale manufactured goods and construction materials. And being allowed to sell those goods that they produce into a market-based system. And so from 1978 to 1996, these township and village enterprises increased to a stage where they account for about a quarter of GDP in China. There's increasing openness to international trade in this period. So China opens up what are called the special economic zones in coastal regions where there's foreign direct investment allowed, and rapidly that's taken up by foreign companies taking advantage of cheap Chinese labour to produce manufactured goods, and such is the success of these zones that the foreign direct investments rapidly moves outside those zones to rural areas pretty much along the coast or to other coastal provinces in China. There's also the commencement of reform to the state enterprise sector, which is the industrial urban-based production sector, and the introduction of what's known as a dual track system, which is quite like what happens in the household responsibility system, that the state enterprises are given output targets that they have to produce for the state, but then they're also told that if they produce amounts of output above that, they're able to sell that output at market prices. And so what happens is that progressively the share of output that these enterprises are producing for market-based activity is increasing. So increasingly these state enterprises are exposed to market-based competition and market-based prices. You can see this idea of prices playing a greater role in economic activity in this graph. This is the percentage of sales, retail and agricultural sales, that take place at fixed prices set by the government. And so before reform takes place in 1978, that's up above 90% in both the sectors. But by 1985, it's come down to about 40%, and by the early 1990s, it's down to about 10%. So China basically shifts from a system where most agricultural outputs being procured at fixed prices and most industrial outputs being sold at prices set by the state, to a system where 15 years later 90% of prices are essentially being set in the market or with some lesser degree of state control than the complete fixing. This is just a graph of China to show where the special economic zones were. So they are, as you can see, in coastal areas around there, and the idea is that these are the initial places where there's foreign direct investment, where foreign firms are allowed to set up business to take advantage of cheap Chinese labour, but pretty rapidly this expands to other coastal areas in China, becoming a major driver of growth in industrial economic activity in those regions. A couple of main themes which are often identified with growth in China, with reform in China during this period. One is this idea of experimentation under hierarchy. So there was no big plan to start off with. Instead, a lot of the approaches to reform involved small-scale initiatives. So initially, the reform to agriculture involves some provinces being allowed to go more rapidly than other provinces, and doesn't involve the complete dismantling of state procurement. It just involves saying, look, you've still got to produce for the state a particular amount, but if you produce above that, you can keep that amount. Or the special economic zones, the idea that what you're doing is you're sort of putting your toe in the water to try to see what effects foreign direct investment will have. You don't say foreign companies can come in and invest anywhere. You say, look, we're experimenting. We're doing it in a controlled set of regions. And that really limits the costs from unsuccessful experiments. So if it turns out that an experiment fails, for example, suppose China had moved to immediately marketize all of food production. The danger is that if that turns out to be a hugely disruptive experience, then food production could be actually reduced in a way that introduces the possibility of major shortages of food. But instead what happens is the scheme involves saying, look, you still have to provide a particular amount to the state, which underpins the amount of output that's going to be produced, but then we're going to experiment on the margin. That experimentation, of course, all takes place under a hierarchy, and where the hierarchy thinks the experiment works, then it can roll it out on a larger scale. Second important point is the idea that here there's reform without losers. That there isn't anyone really who is directly made worse off by these reforms in an economic sense. That if you're in the agricultural sector, you can really only gain by being allowed to produce more. If you're in the state sector, there's a requirement that no jobs are lost, that the process of producing for market can't involve a reduction in numbers employed. So this is important in terms of winning support for economic reform, that if there's no one who's being disadvantaged by economic reform, you don't have a group who are going to argue against economic reform. The final point is that there's significant, as we'll talk about a little bit later in this section of the lecture, there's significant growth in household saving, which underpins a lot of this economic development. Now, these two themes of experimentation under hierarchy and reform without losers, they're very significant, sort of. We'll see in the next section of this lecture when we talk about the Soviet Union that some commentators, such as Richard Erickson, have said, well, look, in the Soviet Union, if you were going to reform, you had to do it in a wholesale way. China shows that, at least in the case of China, it was possible to implement reform in a piecemeal way. You didn't have to shift wholesale from a system of a communist system to a market system in one step. The second phase of reform from the 1990s onwards, in the late 1980s, economic and political problems converge. The economic problems, which are summarised in this quote from a paper by Brandt, Ma and Rorsky, basically says that, look, there'd been benefits from the economic reforms to the agriculture sector, the household responsibility system, from the township and village enterprises. There'd been some benefits from state reform, but basically these state enterprises were still a huge part of the economy that was functioning inefficiently. And so that you really, if you were going to continue the path to further economic growth, you had to do something to address the performance of these state-owned enterprises. At the same time, there's urban discontent being fueled by high inflation in the 1980s, perception that while no one might be losing, that there are some people in society who are gaining more than others, and rising expectations from the general increase in economic well-being of political reform, which of course a most well-known manifestation is the Tiananmen Square episode and the deaths that occur there. And out of this period, you get initially a battle for who will take control of the economy. In the end, it's the economic reformers who prevail, and this initiates a second wave of reform in the Chinese economy. In this case, a stage which does involve structural change to the economy that's going to involve some losers. So, for example, state-owned enterprises are reformed in a way that workers are made redundant in some enterprises. And some state-owned enterprises are now allowed to fail if they're not performing as efficiently or as profitably in a market sense as the judge is judged appropriate. There's also ownership reforms to state-owned enterprises, legalisation of private enterprises, a significantly reduced role of the state sectors, such as privatisation of urban housing, and an important development, which is the increasing role of an independent financial system to fund, for example, investment activities of the new private enterprises, taking the place of the state allocating investment funds. So instead of the state deciding how much would be invested in different areas of economic activity, increasingly that role is directed towards an independent financial system, as would happen in a market-based economy. There's further liberalisation of international trade and foreign direct investment, and in the 1990s, China starts to, or significantly improves its capacity to achieve macroeconomic stability. So a big issue for China in the 1980s with the move towards a market system has been putting in place institutions to allow it to control the macro economy. And initially it struggles with that, and there's high inflation in some periods during the 1980s. But by the 1990s, it starts to develop the institutions and the experience of management that lets it deal more effectively with problems such as inflation. And, for example, China's experience in dealing effectively with the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis using fiscal stimulus shows the capacity it's developed to deal with macroeconomic stability. This is a table that tells you where the productivity growth in China has come from. It shows the average annual rate of change in TFP, first of all for a series of sub-periods in the overall period we're looking at here, and then for the whole of the period from 1978 to 2007. You can see, first of all, that the growth in TFP in agriculture in the initial reform period, and then carried on through later periods, so that relatively strong growth in TFP throughout the whole period in agriculture. Then we've got the two non-agriculture sectors, state and non-state and state. And so you can see that non-state, relatively strong growth in the initial period of reform carried through to the later periods. So it's also been a relatively consistent contributor to productivity growth in China. The state sector is the one where we see a bit of variation, where in fact in the initial period TFP goes backward a little bit in the period from the late 80s and through quite a bit of the 90s. There's some TFP growth, but still relatively slow compared to the other sectors. And then it's only really from 1998 onwards that we start to see growth in productivity in the state sectors following those reforms in the 1990s, which really start to be directed a lot more towards improving the productivity performance of the state enterprises. And so when we look at the period as a whole, we see, even though there has been that later improvement, the improvement in productivity in the state non-agriculture sector has been more limited than the non-state. And then if we look across to the aggregate column, we can see that fairly steady growth throughout the three sub-periods, and an average growth rate in total factor productivity of about 3.5% during the whole period. To finish this section, I want to just talk about some general factors that explain China's growth during this period as a way of sort of tying back to the growth experience of other countries that we've talked about during their periods of most rapid economic growth. So one point is that clearly China is an economy where there's significant scope for catch-up and convergence. So in China, there's been significant political instability in the 60s and 70s, which has disrupted economic growth, as I showed, for example, in the section of the lecture on the famine. It's also the case that China is a relatively poor economy, so it's a long way behind the technological leaders. So China has significant scope for catch-up and convergence. One way of thinking about this is to think that, well, China actually had a dual transition to make. Not only did it have the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy to make, similar to economies like Japan, the other Western economies we've talked about, but it also had the transition to make from being a bureaucratic socialist economy to a market-based economy. So in a way, China sort of had a supercharged opportunity for catch-up and convergence. Of course, as we've talked about before, having the opportunity to catch up and converge doesn't mean that actually happens. And so China, an important part of thinking about the China experience is thinking about the fact that it made a successful transition, that it did that through a gradualist approach to reform rather than what you might call a big bang approach to reform, the idea of experimentalism. That it developed policies which were incremental, which were designed to deal with problems that had arisen, which were tailor-made, rather than trying to implement sort of broad-based, much more broad-based policy solutions. And finally, that an explanation for this successful transition was the idea that it had reform without losers, that by in the first couple of decades of reform, really using approaches that meant that some people might be dissatisfied with the amount they gained, but that certainly economically people shouldn't have been made worse off to a significant degree by these economic reforms, the idea that that's an important part of the transition. Also, though, it's important to recognise that there were some legacies from the planning year, that China had a relatively educated workforce. It had a workforce that had relatively high levels of scientific and technical knowledge, that it had a relatively productive agricultural sector, and there's also the long-term legacy of commercial administrative skills, which go right back to the imperial period in China. This is a table that just makes the point about the scope of China to benefit from structural change. So as well as the idea that China is behind in, for example, its efficiency of industrial production, leading countries, there's also the idea, similar to European countries, similar to Japan, that putting a worker in industry is going to make that worker much more productive than that worker being in agriculture. And so certainly the estimates for China suggest that workers would be more productive in industry by a factor of several times compared to in industry compared to agriculture. Then the fact that China in 1978 still has such a large proportion of its workforce in agriculture means that, again, you have a significant scope for the economy to grow through that process of switching workers from agriculture to industry. And so you can see that what happens is that in 1978, there's about 70% of workers in agriculture. By 2007, that's 25%. Most of those workers being transferred into the non-state, non-agricultural sector. And that decline in the proportion of workers in agriculture being mirrored in the change in GDP, where GDP in the share of GDP in agriculture declines, and there's this huge share in the proportion of China's GDP in non-state industrial production. Other factors that are important in China's growth are, first of all, that it has the capacity to sustain rapid increases in financing the investment that's needed to underpin industrialization, both for capital and labour. So, for example, China is notable for its exceptionally high rates of investment underpinned by the high rates of saving in its economy, and also notable for its financing of increased education attainment. So this graph has China shows gross national savings in China as a percentage of GDP against the US and against a couple of other developing economies. And you can see savings rates in China during the period in which it's shifting to a market economy, well above that in the United States, well above that for most of the period in Brazil, comparable to that in South Korea for the period in the 80s and 90s. And of course, we've talked about this in the last lecture, the idea that a notable feature of the Asian economies that grew fast was that they invested a large proportion and that was financed to a large degree by domestic savings. So it's not surprising to see Korea and China having a similar proportion of savings in the 80s and 90s. But then you see that in the 2000s, China really takes it to another level, increasing its proportion of savings to over 50%. So the capacity of China to finance in investment in capital, investment in education, underpinned by strong domestic savings has been an important factor in explaining its economic growth. And then thirdly and finally, the opening up of the economy in a variety of stages to international trade and to foreign direct investment. And in particular, the reviving of traditional economic relationships with countries like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the rest of Southeast Asia. Part of what we've talked about a couple of times with globalization, China becoming part of an intra-regional economy in Asia during this period, and progressively moving up the value chain in terms of the type of manufactured products that it's been able to produce in that integrated economic unit. So that's the story of China after it made the transition to a market-based or a reformed economy. In the next section of the lecture, I'll talk about the experience of the Soviet Union after it made a similar transition.